I'll give some background before I tell you the encounters I had. I went to an all-boys boarding school from the age of 13 until just after my 18th birthday. My school was old, and I mean really old. It was founded over 450 years ago, back in 1552. To put that into context for my American friends, that's 245 years before the USA was founded. With a place that old, it carries things. As you can probably imagine, I have a lot of stories from my 5 years of service at my school. Feel free to ask any questions. One last disclaimer. I am in no way a writer, so I do apologize if this post comes out and makes no sense whatsoever. My first couple weeks at school were incredibly nerve-wracking. I had never spent more than a night or two away from home, so I felt homesick and overworked as I was getting used to my new work schedule. But I was making friends with some of the boys in my year, and things were looking up. At this point, I was probably the smallest boy in my year. I hadn't hit my growth spurt yet, and I wouldn't for a couple more years. The older boys in our schoolhouse would tell us stories of how the school was haunted, and that we should never adventure alone past sunset. My friends and I did not believe them in the slightest. We assumed that they were just playing tricks on the new boys, but we were so wrong. I remember the first time something odd happened. I was quite under the weather and had a high temperature. This was within my first month of moving into the school. My teacher suggested that I should take a cold shower. It was late in the evening, and the showers were usually reserved for first thing in the morning, unless you had PE that day. I remember feeling rather dizzy, and so my friend offered to accompany me. We went down to the shower room together. Having showers at my school was probably the most awkward thing I remember about my time there. One big open room with a dozen or so shower heads. That was a tough thing to get used to when I first started, but I did get used to it rather quickly. I was never really shy about my body or anything like that, but still, there were at least 2.5 dozen boys in my schoolhouse. When we were all crammed together in a completely open communal shower room, it was awkward to say the least. But back to the point. My friend and I went down there late in the evening. We placed our clothes under a shower head that wasn't going to be used by either of us and got in the shower. The hot water boiler would not have been on at that time in the evening, so my cold shower certainly was cold. After around 5 minutes of my friend and I standing in the freezing cold water, all at once, every unused shower turned on full blast. As well as that, the freezing water suddenly turned boiling hot, like red hot. I'm sure if my friend and I didn't manage to get out of the way of the water before it reached full temperature, we would have been burned badly. We immediately made a run for the door of the shower room, but it was locked, and we couldn't get it open. We started panicking, as you could imagine. 2 naked 13-year-old boys slamming on the shower door with all we could muster. Then, almost as fast as they had all started, the showers stopped. I remember that my heart was racing like it had never raced before. I remember feeling as if I was drowning in the steam from the showers. After that, the showers started spurting out something that looked like bright red blood, and I won't ever forget the smell. It smelled like rusty metal mixed with sewage. My friend and I were truly cowering at the door by this point. I'll speak for myself when I say that was the scariest thing I had experienced up until that point in my life. Then, again, it stopped, and the door unlocked. Our clothes were truly ruined, along with our towels. My teachers were very strict. They could be downright mean sometimes. You did not want to be punished at my school. And that's what terrified us more in that moment. We were more scared of being sent to the headmaster's office than we were of whatever event just happened, paranormal or not. So we did our best to clean it up, but it didn't work. The room still looked as if a bomb had been dropped. So we went to our head of house and explained what happened. He seemed confused, perhaps even slightly scared. He told us to go back to our dorm. The next day, the shower room was closed, and we had to use another house's room. As I said, this was probably the first time I experienced something that I cannot explain, whether it was paranormal or not, which personally, I'm almost certain it was. How else would all the showers turn themselves on and the door lock itself? This is only one story from my 5 years at my school, and honestly, this is one of the mildest. Second encounter. This takes place around 2 months after the last incident with the showers. It was the first Christmas holiday, and most boys were packing up to spend 2 weeks at home with their parents. My parents had already written to me and said they were too busy for me to come home, so I would be spending the holiday there. I have to admit, I was disappointed, but I did as I was told. All of the friends I had made left for the holiday, so I was pretty lonely, but I was enjoying some rest time. For those of you who don't know how most boarding schools in Britain work, we had a 6-day week. We had normal lessons all day from Monday through Saturday, and on Sunday, we had to attend a church service for the first half of the day, meaning we only got one afternoon off to rest in the week. So I spent most of the time I was allowed in bed reading books. The weird things became much more prominent during the holidays. It was as if whatever energies that were there became braver when there were less people around. In my schoolhouse of around 2.5 dozen boys, only 4 had stayed for the holiday. Only 1 was the same age as me, and none had stayed for my dorm room, which I have to admit I was thrilled about. Well, I was at first anyway. The first couple or so nights went by fine. I was doing my 13-year-old boy thing, and I won't go into any more detail about that. But after the first few days of peace, the weird things started again. At first, it wasn't anything major. Echoes of screams and moans coming from the courtyard, which I rationalized as the older boys playing pranks. They did scare me though, but I didn't want to appear weak or fall into their prank, so I slept through my fears and didn't ask any of the other boys to come and sleep in my dorm with me. So I slept, and when I woke up, every other bed in my dorm apart from mine had been moved to the far side of the dorm, which thoroughly freaked me out, but again, I assumed it was a prank from some of the older boys. And if it's one thing I had learned by this point, if you're being pranked or joked on in any way, show no weakness or it will keep happening. So I moved all of the beds back myself and went down for a shower. When I got down there was another boy already in the shower room. I can't remember exactly how old he was, but he was in the older years, so probably around 15 or 16. For this story, I'll name him Toby. By this point, I was used to showering with others, so I didn't care that he was there at all. He told me about his plan for sneaking down at night and breaking into the dessert kitchen and having a midnight feast. He asked if I wanted to join him, and though I have never done anything against the rules before, he assured me that he had done it loads of times and had never been caught. So I agreed. Later that day, I got ready in a suit of all black to be able to sneak around more effectively. Toby was just wearing his normal clothes and looked at me like I was a huge nerd when I explained my reasoning for my clothes. And so, we started sneaking down to the kitchen. When we got there, we started eating as much ice cream as we could, when suddenly, a whole shelf of tin food threw itself onto the floor, and the kitchen doors slammed themselves shut. I looked at Toby in a what do we do kind of way. We picked up some food and left almost as quickly as we came. Toby and I started walking back towards our schoolhouse, and this is the bit that still gives me chills to this day. We heard footsteps coming up the hall on our way back. We assumed that it was a teacher, so we found somewhere to hide until they had passed. But no one came, and we carried on walking back towards our dorm. This is when I felt something grab my leg and yank it. I fell down and got back up. We looked around us, and there was no one around. We started running because we were both scared when something yanked Toby's leg. He fell, and he fell way worse than I did, and banged the front of his head and got a bloody nose. He got back up relatively quickly, as he was a rugby boy and was used to this kind of thing. By this point, we were sprinting full speed back to our schoolhouse. When we got back, we swore that we wouldn't speak of what happened again, out of fear of getting in trouble. I went to my dorm and tried to get some sleep, but I was terrified of what had just happened. After a couple hours of just laying there, I managed to get to sleep. I woke up at some point in the night to my bed along with the others in my dorm being slammed into the far side of the room with force. At this point, I was completely done with this, so I got up and went into Toby's dorm. I explained what happened in my dorm to someone who I thought would understand. He told me he knew what I was talking about, and told me to make a bed in his dorm, and I slept in there for the rest of the holiday. On the plus side, Toby looked out for me during the time he was at the school, and we still keep in touch now.
To the creepy driver instructor, let's not ever meet again. This happened a few years ago, when I was 18 or 19. I started taking driving lessons, first the theoretical part, which ends in a written test, then the practical part, with the actual learning of driving a car. It's a bit of a long story since it spans over a few months, so bear with me. Spoiler, it ends well, at least for me. Now, I was never really interested in learning how to drive, as I live in a suburban area next to a very big city, so public transportation is rarely an issue. Still, I knew it was an essential skill to have, and I didn't want to end up being that one person in a group who always needs a driver, so I took the lessons. Theory was fine and easy, but when it came to the driving part, I was very nervous and not confident at all. I wasn't doing too bad, but I wasn't good either. Anyway, in my driving school, each student basically has a main driving instructor so that they can track your progress much more easily than if you're going from teacher to teacher, with the occasional switching to another, depending on when you take your hour of driving. My main driving instructor always seemed a bit weird to me. Not in any alarming way, just that he wasn't someone I'd ever want to hang around with. He was in his 50s or late 40s, very, very overweight, and had very long nails, at least for a man, which, for some reason, I found to be very creepy. He had a relatively soft voice, too. At first, for the first few lessons, everything was fine. He wasn't very talkative, only giving me directions. As I progressed from only using the wheel to using the pedals and then the gear shift, however, he started being more open. One thing I noticed, though, was that he always complimented me, even when I did something very simple that I'd already done several times, and never said when I did stuff wrong. Obviously, I did plenty of that. It bothered me because even though I certainly didn't want to get yelled at, I still needed to get better, and it wasn't going to happen that way. Then, one day, as we were parked near the driving school at the end of a lesson, he leaned on the side to reach me and kissed me on the cheek to say goodbye. It seriously weirded me out, but not as much as you'd think. You see, in my country, that's what we do to say goodbye and hello. You've probably guessed where I'm from with that. Though not in a professional setting, and certainly not between teacher and student. So it was weird, but not overly alarming. Another day, he said he was going to buy me a coffee when I passed my test. This, I said sure, with pleasure. I didn't see anything wrong with my driving instructor buying me a €1 coffee at the machine in celebration. Except that a couple of lessons later, we were talking and happened to pass in front of a McDonald's, and he joked that when I pass my test, he'll take me to a restaurant, but a much better one than a fast food chain. That, no. Another red flag. One day, the director of the school rode in the back with us, as he was basically doing checkups on the students, and suddenly my driving instructor was doing his job perfectly, asking me if I had questions, going over what I did wrong and what I did right. A real, normal driving lesson. It felt nice for once. By now, I was 10 times more nervous going to the lessons. I kept making excuses to cancel, but in my country, driving lessons are extremely expensive, and you can only cancel 48 hours before. So I couldn't possibly afford to lose any money. By this point, I just wanted to get it over with as quickly as possible. Problem is, I just wasn't making any progress. A couple of times, we did a bit of an overtime, like 5 or 10 minutes, nothing major, and he once told me that he could give me private lessons, and that'd be our little secret. Yes, that one cliche sentence. The kissing thing kept on for a few lessons. He had even put his hand on mine over the gear shift a few times, or touched my leg as an excuse to reach for something. Then, he did the one thing I couldn't take. He must have looked at my file and got my phone number. He then sent me a text asking an innocent question about the time of our next lesson, except that this kind of stuff goes through the secretary, not the instructors themselves. That's when I decided to act. I just couldn't take it anymore, and I absolutely didn't want this creep to have my number. So I went to the secretary and asked to change instructors. When she asked why, I let everything out. The stress, the harassment, some of the things he said and did. She was horrified, said that of course she'd switch me to someone else, but also asked that I go to the director and tell him everything to get this guy fired. So I did. I knew he was a good person, and only a couple of sentences in, he had his head in his hands, in pure despair. He asked for a screenshot of the text, which I sent him. He said he would do his best, but where I live, you can't just fire someone on a whim. You need proofs, solid reasons, and the like. Something I'd never be sad about before now. Anyway, a few days later, I got a new instructor, one who had no issue pointing out my mistakes. It hurt a bit, especially when I realized that I was much worse than I thought, and that most of my lessons had been completely useless. Still, it was a nice change to be treated like an idiot. The creepy instructor wasn't fired for a few weeks, so sometimes I sadly crossed paths with him, but he always avoided looking in my direction. I guess he knew exactly who ratted him out. I admit it frightened me a bit that he'd try to do something in retaliation. 2 things happened after he was fired, which make this whole story even worse. I worked at a fast food chain, so I was around lots of other people my age. And when talking to one of them, we realized that she too had issues with him. Same kind of behavior, except that she was luckier because she passed her test not long after she first had a lesson with him. You have to know that physically we couldn't be more different. She's black, I'm white. She's thin, I'm overweight. She has long hair and I have short hair. So did he just try to hit on every single girl he came into contact with? Despite him being married, obviously, no matter who they were, hoping he'd get one in bed. What about the many minors he must have come in contact with? Lastly, the day I passed my test, with only one mistake, the director of the agency told me that a few days earlier he'd seen the creepy instructor in another driving school car with another young girl sitting next to him. Right now, he's probably still out there, traumatizing young girls like me. Maybe he's even managed to go further than he got with me, and this upsets me to no end.
I need help. I cross-posted this on a bunch of different threads to try and find answers, because I'm terrified to move on to the property we just bought. January of this year was a very dark place for me emotionally. My husband and I grew estranged after the loss of our 6-day-old youngest son. For about 2 months, December and January, we were apart as he spiraled with substance abuse to numb the pain. He left town and stayed with his father across the state. When he came back to town, we wanted to see each other again. He checked into a hotel in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. I drove out to see him around 7 p.m. when our then 2-year-old son fell asleep. We were staying with my mother during this time, and she offered to watch our little one. I stayed for a few hours. It was very emotional, to say the least. We wanted to reconcile and overcome the tragedy that we had faced. Around midnight or so, I knew I would have to get back to my mother's house in case our son woke up. It was pitch black outside, and my GPS led me down a narrow road. I was eager to get home, and although very overwhelmed, I was wide awake due to the adrenaline of seeing my husband for the first time after our separation. I crossed over a stream and started going slightly uphill. In the middle of the road was a set of bright green eyes. I instantly slowed down because there are a ton of deer in the area. If there is one deer, there are usually more. I slowly creeped up the hill in my minivan, scanning for more eyes, and the figure in the middle of the road scuttled to the right-hand side, then stayed perfectly still and positioned. Scuttled is the only way to describe the way it moved, honestly. To the right was a big open field with some trees and brush lining the perimeter alongside the road. The thing was along the brush, almost like it was trying to blend in. It was on both its hands and feet. Its arms were unnaturally long and bent at an angle. Its eyes were that reflective green the entire time I drove past it, with no pupils. I don't think it looked at me directly. After it positioned itself in the brush, it stared past me with a black hole for a mouth. Not gaping, but wide open. Since I slowed down quite a bit to prevent me from hitting what I thought was a deer, I got a good long look at it. About 8-ish feet tall, but on all fours, crouched. The skin looked like orange bark, like it was trying to camouflage along the trees, but it was too orangey tan. And as I crept closer, I saw that it was fleshy, like gross, orangey, swollen, bloody fleshy. The nose is what stood out to me mostly. It was long and pointy. I'd almost compare it to Pinocchio before he would tell a lie. All the same orangey, fleshy color. I hope that makes sense. I don't really know how else to describe it. It happened in seconds. I thought I saw a deer, slowed down as I passed it, and it was not a deer. I kept driving. Almost immediately after I laid my eyes on it, I felt my heartbeat in my throat. Such a horrific sense of dread consumed me, and it almost helped me to continue to act rationally and drive the hell away from there. I then heard a knocking and a huge thud come from the inside of my van, like someone had jumped from the back, but on the inside. All of my windows were up because it was obviously winter, so there was no logical way something could have suddenly appeared as I was driving. All of the hair stood up on the back of my neck, and every instinct I had was telling me to keep staring straight ahead. Do not look behind. Do not look in the rearview mirror. Do not say a word. So I didn't. I struggled to breathe. I had a huge lump in my throat as I sped down that road, so beyond scared, with every fiber of my being on overdrive telling me to get away from there. The second I turned off of that road, that feeling of someone being in the car with me was gone. I looked back, and nobody was there. I kept driving and called my husband in hysterics, half sobbing and half laughing out of shock and saying, "I'm not scared, I'd kick its butt," because I had a feeling it thrived off of my fear. It was one of the most terrifying things I have ever experienced in my life. Months have passed since then. My husband and I have since reconciled and have been even stronger since our fallout. We have tried to look more into it, but every time we started to do more research, I would get a sick feeling in my stomach, almost like my body was warning me to leave it be. I tried to ignore it and forget it for the longest time. My husband and I bought a piece of property locally. As we looked at properties, we stayed away from anything big and open with a field because it reminded me too much of that thing. We purchased a heavily wooded lot about 30 miles away from where this experience took place. We are having a home built custom to our 3-year-old son's needs. Our little guy has cerebral palsy. We move onto the property next week in a camper to oversee construction. But now I'm worried. What if there's another encounter? And I have my little boy with me this time. What if something bad happens and I lose him? I already lost one son. If anything happened to my oldest, I don't know what I'd do. We finally began really digging into what that thing was. We looked into the thing itself based off of its appearance and the location I saw it at. It turns out that field I saw it at was part of a memorial park called Hausnick Park. There was a lot of Native American history tied into that area, so we dug more into the local lore. We came across the term skinwalker. That was probably the closest thing we found that resembled the creature. That's what we've been referring to it as, but there are a few things about my encounter and its appearances that still makes me hesitant to believe with 100% certainty that that was what it was. Can anyone help? Does the look of this creature sound familiar to anyone? Could it really have been a skinwalker or something else? I have a sketch I drew that might be of some help, but I'm no artist. What's up, everybody? This is the Lone Wolf here. Thank you so much for listening to the video. I hope you guys enjoyed these 3 stories. I want to give a big thank you to the Redditors who allowed me to read their stories in this video. There will of course be links to their posts in the description below for anybody else who wants to read them. I also want to give a very special shout out to my guest for this video, Fearsome Hero. She's an awesome horror narrator, and I am very, very glad that I got to work with her. There will be a link to her channel in the description below, as well as an icon that will appear on screen at the end of this closing. So everybody be sure to check out her channel and show her some support. As always, if you're new to my channel, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing if you like the narrations. Hit the bell for notifications and join the Lone Wolf Pack. If any of you guys want to send me a message or maybe a personal scary story that you would like to hear on my channel, there will be a link to my email account and my Twitter account in the description. There will also be links in the description for all of the music artists that I used in this video, along with each individual track that I used for those of you interested in the music. And last but certainly not least, if any of you guys have any ideas or tips for me to make my channel even better, please leave me a comment or send me a personal message. Until next time, stay spooky. And remember, the hunt begins when the moon is full. See you soon.